As always, this talk may seem kind of out of left field, maybe for me, maybe in general, but hopefully the stakes of the way I got here will become clear as I go along. This talk will seem not to be about digital media, but it might be a little bit. So Mikhail Bakhtin's concept of heteroglossia remains one of the more suggestive and productive ideas in critical theory. Developed slowly over the decades from the 1920s to the 1940s and later, heteroglossia evolved from a relatively formal notion occasioned by Bakhtin's observation that some novels, for him especially those of Fyodor Dostoevsky, displayed what Bakhtin first called polyphony, in which multiple voices come together to form a complex whole. For many commentators, polyphony remains the primary understanding of heteroglossia, and for good reason, as celebrating a multiplicity of voices is certainly one of Bakhtin's major goals. Yet heteroglossia points at a deeper and more difficult insight that is easily lost if we understand it simply as polyphony. Although his comments are largely focused on the characteristics of the European novel, Bakhtin makes clear repeatedly that heteroglossia points to a generalizable and widespread phenomenon that is found throughout our use of language. In contrast to heteroglossia, Bakhtin writes of what he calls unitary language, the theoretical expression of the historical processes of linguistic unification and centralization, an expression of the centripetal forces of language. Forces that unite and centralize verbal ideological thought, creating within a heteroglot national language the firm, stable linguistic nucleus of an officially recognized literary language. I think that goes beyond literary language in some of his other writing as well. This unitary or univocal language, sometimes referred to as monologism, seems very close to what more recent thinkers call a standard language ideology, and what we understand in the contemporary US in particular as an ideological monolingualism, one that insists that there is one proper, correct language, better along several axes than the others, and that it is proper or correct for human beings, community members, and citizens to speak only this one language. The ideological pressure to speak one and only one correct language already has clear essentialist overtones. The properly patriotic citizen inhabits and is inhabited by a singular voice, one that directly yokes her to the national, racial, and ethnic subject. To be an American is to speak American, this thinking goes, even though those who adhere to such a worldview differ in surprising ways about what speaking American actually means. In any case, such ideologues are certain that the self's alignment with the racial and nationalist project is specifically evidenced in its mastery of univocal language, one that pretends the self is also unitary, unconflicted, undivided, singular, and not multiple. By contrast, Bakhtin's more advanced notions of heteroglossia challenge both this gross essentialism and a more subtle one that even some who rely on Bakhtin seem at times to dip into. This gross essentialism aligns self, subject, race, gender, and ethnicity, along with other categories, to a singular voice that we each express and to which heteroglossia is meant as a direct challenge. The subtler essentialism is one that theorists such as Spivak, even going back to Can the Subaltern Speak, have long resisted, according to which each of us has a singular voice that, while it might well be resistant to the dominating norms of race and nation, nevertheless aligns strongly with our own identity, especially group identity. One of Spivak's main points in that essay, we may remember, is that for the subaltern to speak, it cannot be assumed or required to inhabit just one position and to speak in just one way. Rather, it must be heard and understood as riven with the same kind of internal division and conflict that the majority typically ascribes only to itself, even if in a sub rosa fashion that conflicts with its ideologies of univocity. Thus, in an important article from the mid-1990s, Dorothy Hale remarks on the deployment of heteroglossia in what was then recent African-American literary criticism. Voice, she writes, has become the metaphor that best accommodates the conflicting desires of critics and theorists who want to have their cultural subject and de-essentialize it too. The specific problem she writes about is the move to make Du Bois's notion of double consciousness synonymous with Bakhtinian double voice. In his writings on double consciousness, Hale points out, Du Bois is explicit that the project of racial liberation as he sees it will lead to this is Du Bois quotes, a better and truer self, the free, sovereign, active soul, a soul in realization of a dream Du Bois has of the Black American merging his double self into a better and truer self. When some critics take up heteroglossia to illustrate Du Bois, they make the mistake of reading Bakhtin in the cruder way, the polyphony way, and the way that suggests that each person has a singular voice, a voice that is true to oneself, which might even be split into two singular voices, if that's possible to understand, but are still authentic and essential, and that polyphonic discourse serves a fundamental political purpose by representing many such voices, including subaltern voices, within a literary or social text that only pretends to be univocal. This problem applies even when the critics suggest, following Du Bois, that a person has precisely two voices inside themselves, with one perhaps more authentic than the other, but with each itself embodying a singular or univocal perspective. These assumptions overlook the subtler and arguably more Bakhtin's arguments, which is that all searches for authentic and essential voice are inherently misguided, because language itself does not work that way, and by extension, our psychology and our political psychology does not either. Thus, as Bakhtin's theory develops, he comes to argue that, quote, an apparently unitary language can actually contain diverse and even interpenetrating sociolinguistic points of view, and that a seemingly singular body of discourse, as restricted to an individual utterance, can itself contain multiple social identities. Then in his most mature work on the topic, Discourse in the Novel, Bakhtin argues that voices are found to reside in language aside from persons, so that subjectivity now becomes an effect of the voices that language speaks through characters. This is Hale again. Bakhtin stresses that identity is never a matter of private interiority, but on the contrary, is always a matter of social relation. And he imagines that a form so localizable as a single utterance can embody the multiplicity of individual and social subjectivity. One way to cash out Hale's argument is that when Du Bois talks about double consciousness, he is talking about an almost entirely different topic from the ones with which Bakhtin is concerned. Hale offers some interesting ways of reconciling their concerns, but I want to stay with her critique of approaches that maintain what I have called the subtler form of essentialism found in both popular discourse and, to my mind, in a growing fraction of contemporary criticism. In many spheres, we are presented with an absolute and unexamined equivalence between voice, subject, identity, and interest, the last being the term that Spivak uses precisely to trouble the easy equivalence between representation in its pictorial and political senses, noting that both Marx and Derrida offer ways of holding on to those differences. Period. Both criticism and representation are reduced and have been reduced with remarkable speed, given the theoretical work that had come before, to an unproblematic univocity, according to which each person's voice and interest are sealed almost unavoidably to their singular and unitary identity. The task of critic and even creative artists alike is straightforward. In this view, highlight and celebrate the occluded voice and minimize or background the more visible. Such an operation has much in common with what Paul Beauvais calls allegoresis in Love's Shadow. And reading that book and thinking about it while reflecting on my own recent experiences in teaching both theory and contemporary literature is part of what has prompted this line of investigation. To be sure, I am making allegoresis a kind of metaphor, and that I am aligning Beauvais' idea of a singular unitary meaning to be extracted from a representational work with the idea of a singular unitary voice. I came to this observation by observing something that I find quite troubling in the classroom, especially recently. In teaching both criticism and theory on the one hand, and film and literature on the other, I have increasingly found a surprising and to me very unwelcome term. Much recent criticism recommends and often demands from its audience one correct interpretation of some of the most complicated and important issues of our times. The tone of this criticism is often harsh and despairing, melancholic as Beauvais describes it. That melancholy is itself univocal. The only way to understand our present circumstances is in nihilistic or at best deeply pessimistic terms. The only voice that is acceptable is a tone of despair or outrage verging on nihilism. Despite the hopelessness of this view, it is also imperative, for some reason, to thinkers who operate in this mode to do everything they can to convince the readers of the correctness of their pessimism. Like Beauvais, I don't want to dwell on or even analyze examples of this kind of work, except to note that while it is by no means the rule, it is common enough to be easily visible, and that it is found even more commonly in social media than in formal criticism. Although a great deal of criticism today seems to be influenced by the Manichaean bias of social media. I guess that is the place where social media turns up in this talk a little bit. I do think this is partly about the influence of social media on recent criticism, which I think in many ways has been extremely destructive. And what I've noticed alongside this development, especially when teaching, is that quite a bit of recent fictional representation embraces and even forcefully depicts both the impossibility and undesirability of such unitary interpretations, and often does so through resisting the identification of unitary voice with unitary identity. This is, of course, by no means universal, but I find it notable, not least since it is clear from the texts themselves that the creators are often quite aware of some of the texts we read in critical theory, and perhaps even more strongly the ways in which the loudest voices on social media tend to merge with the most Manichaean and least nuanced critical views. So this is what I want to call critical heteroglossia, despite the fact that I see it occurring far more often in critical and fictional productions than in properly critical ones. To be as clear as possible before I go forward, I am not talking about holding open for debate such basic questions as whether racism and police violence exist in the United States. Rather, the kinds of questions that seem to get foreclosed too easily are about the nature of racial thinking and racist policies, the relationship between governance and race, the nature of race and its relation to identity, and many other such topics, all of which those of us familiar with the long history of critical theory know have been subject to the deepest kinds of debate and discussion. These are fantastically complex questions, at least to my mind, and ones that demand the deepest and most expansive sort of investigation. And anyone who tells us they have the answers to them is fooling themselves or others. When works of theory operate in this mode, they have a troubling tendency to foreclose discussion and investigation, and I find this tendency transfers easily to the classroom. Some students may well argue with the premises of a theoretical work, but such arguments are themselves often structured far too much by the univocal nature of the work itself. Either one is for it or one is against it. Often students just sigh and echo the pessimism or nihilism of the work. Discussion is difficult, if not impossible. To be sure, writing in this mode is to a large extent unavoidable for critics, and it is often welcome. I'm not saying there's anything wrong necessarily with making a sustained argument, and I'm to some extent doing that here, but we are all familiar with the fact that we know sometimes how to credit that there are alternative views about the topics that we're coming to, and I'll just say what seems to be that kind of disagreement seems to be rejected in favor of the articulation of something like a critical catechism, one that again seems to be very directly related to the affordances of social media. Slogans, which taken in the most literal sense are deeply nihilistic and melancholic, replace deep engagement with ideas and issues. Only one position is tolerated. Answers are obvious. Anyone who dissents from these obvious answers is part of the problem. And anyone who asks for elaboration on the meanings of slogans, even when these slogans appear vague and even contradictory on the surface, should know that they risk being able to participate in the ongoing conversation at all. Just to digress for 1 second, part of the observation that I didn't quite put into writing here is that like even this semester, I am teaching a theory class on the one hand and a contemporary fiction class on the other. And of course, we talk about the same topics in those two classes, right? And what I have noticed is that the fiction class is so much better at talking about these issues than the theory class. And also, I can't teach most contemporary theory in the theory class anymore. It is so pessimistic and nihilistic. And yet I can teach very recent fiction that's what I do. The fiction class, which I'm going to talk about, and the works I'm going to talk about are not really even exemplary. It's a class I've developed over many years. I go back a couple of years in the Booker Prize long list and choose books that are short enough and diverse enough and look interesting enough to read. And there are books I haven't read. I use it as a chance for a senior seminar, right? And I assign 11 or 12 recent novels and films and read them with the students. And we end up talking about all the deep topics I want to talk about in the theory class. And yet the fiction opens up the ability to talk about these questions in a way that the theory just seems often not to do. So I'm going to give two brief examples before I'll turn to the longer one, which I'll talk. And again, there's nothing particularly exemplary about these works. They just happen to be ones that there's so many that this is true of. And the two books I'm going to talk about are ones I just happen to be teaching this semester. The first is Katie Kitamura's 2021 Intimacies, in which the novel's unnamed narrator has taken on a new job as an interpreter at the International Criminal Court at The Hague. The main plot in the novel, insofar as it has one, has to do with the narrator's personal life, her relationship with a married man, and how the work at the ICC impacts her own well-being. Her ICC work largely focuses on interpreting from unnamed but, quote, well-known jihadist who stood accused of 4 counts of crimes against humanity and 5 counts of war crimes. She first meets the accused at the court's detention center, where he conducts himself much as one might expect an authoritarian leader to, playing power games with her and others. She observes and interprets for the accused at one hearing, and we learn that he was president of an unnamed country, where after he lost an election but refused to cede power, he formed an army of mercenaries and began a process of ethnic cleansing, leading to death squads and mass graves. Despite interventions from the UN and the African Union, the president was unrepentant, and eventually only military action could remove him from power and stop the ongoing genocide. As the unnamed narrator navigates her duties in translating for the president, we read that she is aware of a protest movement outside the ICC, making claims that were not unfamiliar to anyone who worked at the court. According to this movement, the court had primarily investigated and made arrests in African countries, even as crimes against humanity proliferated around the world. The narrator remarks that there is much correct about these claims, but also that a narrative becomes persuasive not through complexity but conviction, and that this narrative did not reflect the complexities of the court's jurisdiction, nor its numerous preliminary investigations into situations around the world. Critically, the narrator never accepts or rejects this protest movement. And while the narrative does eventually turn on the somewhat surprising exoneration of the president, the book as a whole holds this vital question in suspension. It is clear that both the narrator and the novel take these claims very seriously, and yet do not simply accept them and repeat them at face value. Another recent novel, Hell of a Book by Jason Mott, which won the National Book Award for 2021, has a fascinating divided structure in which another unnamed narrator, author of a novel also titled Hell of a Book, goes on a book tour, long comic sections of which alternate with the story of a young Black boy who seems to have the ability to make himself invisible. The book is largely jovial in tone, at least for the first half. Yet as it proceeds, we come to suspect that the boy may be the same person as the narrator, or the spectral boy who keeps appearing before and speaking with the author. And then relatively late in the book, we learn that the boy has seen his father murdered by police in his own front yard. In the main narrative, we discover that the unnamed narrator seems to have virtually no identity at all, and does not even know he is Black until a publicity coach hired by his agent tells him that he is. The same coach praises him for being Black, but not writing a book about race. The main narrative indeed seems not to be directly about race for the most part, but the interstitial chapters certainly are. As the book comes to its conclusion, we see that the main narrative is a kind of scream, and that the author may be experiencing some kind of dissociation, precisely deriving from what may be his own direct experience with racist police violence. Toward the end of the book, we read a second story about a young Black boy killed by a police officer rather than his father, which seems perhaps closer to the author's own experience, although obviously he wasn't killed. The book ends with a kind of coda in which a dialogue is staged between the author or narrator and some version of the boy who has haunted him. Neither occupies an obvious position. They don't entirely agree with each other, and neither of them seems to have a clear answer on how to proceed or even how to live in this country, despite their joint determination that they must. The tragic understory and the comic overstory come together, and the reader comes to see that this is very much a book about police violence toward Black people in the US, and about how to write and continue living despite or in the face of it. The dialogic ending, along with the fragmented narrative form and the novel's metafictional content, portray open struggles with and questioning about how to tell these stories without giving in to melancholy allegories and monologism. The final example I want to talk about comes from the recent television comedy program Southside, one of the more interesting examples of representational heteroglossia in current media. Set squarely in the Black community in the South Side of Chicago, on the crudest theory, the program might be expected to be particularly univocal. Instead, the show is remarkable for its diversity along many axes, including in particular, diversity within individual characters themselves, few of whom are easily characterized in terms of having singular voices. To the contrary, one of the most challenging aspects of the show is learning to understand the complex character portrayals, which often seem to be highly parodic, sympathetic, sincere, and critically satirical all at once. Trying to understand whether viewers are supposed to be laughing at, laughing with, outraged, or amused by the characters is one of the program's interesting and oddly powerful challenge. And if one is sensitive, it can also make viewers think hard about how various audience members are expected to understand what happens in the show. And the South Side is produced, created, acted in, filmed in the area that it is about. And so it is clearly partly directed at members of that community for the enjoyment of members of that community, but it is also clearly thinking about a lot of other audiences that are going to watch it. The program focuses on four main characters, all of them employed in professions that are often understood to be at best problematic, both inside and outside the local community. The two main protagonists, Simon and Kareem, work for a rent-to-own company, typically understood as a highly exploitative business. Simon's main job is to repossess rented products from people who aren't keeping up payments, often Black South Side residents of limited means. And of course, Simon and Kareem themselves are in similar economic straits. Rent-to-own is already a pretty unsavory business to be involved in, but Simon, who is played by one of the show's creators, Sultan Salahuddin, is always looking for ways to get rich, many of them based on scams. The other two slightly less central protagonists, Officer Goodnight, who is played by another showrunner, Sultan's brother Bashir Salahuddin, and Officer Zenobia Turner, played by Chandra Russell, who is in fact married to Bashir Salahuddin in real life, are beat cops for the local police. They're low-level street cops, so we rarely see them deal with serious criminal activity, but more often follow them in relatively ordinary interactions with community members, especially the rent-to-own company itself, which they have some nominal responsibility to watch over. Even more than Simon and Kareem, the two officers are very much comic characters, and at best marginally competent at their jobs. It is surely striking in a show that tries to be very close to the ground in portraying life in a majority Black community, produced, written, directed, filmed in, and populated with members of that community, including many non-actors as well as actors who play the main roles, that two of its main characters are police officers, let alone that they are generally depicted as benign or bumbling. When first encountering the program, especially if it is recommended as a somewhat realistic depiction of life in an urban Black community, that is one of its features that seems jarring at first, maybe to people outside of that community. And I think that that is deliberate. There is very little discussion or portrayal of police violence throughout the series, for example. And the program definitely gives the impression that violence is rarely a part of the lives of its characters, despite the fact that Kareem and Simon often have to retrieve appliances from people who would rather not give them up, and that the two officers often break up minor scuffles of various kinds. In contrast with many other programs that aim to depict life in economically marginalized Black communities, the emphasis in Southside is on an ordinary life that seems punctuated far more by striving for an elusive prosperity than it is punctuated by violence. None of the characters in Southside are exactly admirable, but few of them are villainous, even when they do things that harm other community members, although these harms are typically minor. Each of them has multiple aspects to his or her personality, so that the viewer is never sure who may end up looking good and who bad by the end of an episode. Although Officer Goodnight is the most frequent butt of jokes, and Zenobia and Simon are most often setting up schemes that fizzle out. The episode I want to focus on here is called Turner Buys a Building, which is from the program's first season. Zenobia and Officer Goodnight briefly intersect with the episode's main plot, in which Simon and Kareem attempt to retrieve a microwave oven from a customer who isn't paying his bills, and who turns out to be using the microwave to run a clandestine business selling popcorn on the street. After he runs away from Simon and Kareem's attempt to retrieve the microwave from his home, Zenobia and Goodnight arrest him after he hops on a bus to escape to rent-to-own people. As they arrest the man, Zenobia insults Goodnight and then laughs when the man they are arresting says to Goodnight, "Eat a dick, Carl Winslow," referring to the buffoonish police officer on the sitcom Family Matters. Goodnight asks Zenobia, "Whose side are you on?" She responds, the law, Playboy, and mine. She says this, and Goodnight takes the man to, as she says this, and Goodnight takes the man to the police car, Zenobia's gaze falls across the street on a dilapidated dilapidated rental building with a for sale sign. She looks at the house, smiles, and says, I like you, and calls a friend on her police radio, asking if she still has her real estate license. As the scene cuts, viewers are unaware whether to delight in her lack of concern for her official duties or to see her as concocting yet another scheme that is unlikely to pay off, to see her as predatory in her use of her position to aid her personal business interests, and so on. After a cut back to the popcorn plot, which ends with Simon hatching yet another scheme, this time to get in on the street popcorn selling game, saying, I'm coming for you, Warren Buffett, one kernel at a time. The show returns to Zenobia and the dilapidated house. She is now negotiating with the owner of the house, an older Black man sitting on the stoop who appears to be a community resident, actual community resident, non-actor. She offers him $9,000 for the house, and he counters that $9,500 is as low as he goes. Zenobia objects that she hasn't seen the inside of the house yet, and the owner says, my listing was very clear, sight unseen, building comes as is, where is. Now Officer Goodnight seems sharper than Zenobia, asking, where is? I'm sorry, is this a move? He turns to her and asks, I'm sorry, but are you really about to buy a building that we just saw up the street right now? He points out all the houses nearby that have known gang affiliations, though gangs are not a frequent topic on the show, one exception being this episode's A-plot, when we ultimately learn that a gang controls the sale of street popcorn. Zenobia's only response is profit. Mere moments ago, Zenobia was the more streetwise member of the pair, but in this exchange, Goodnight seems suddenly to be more reasonable. The shifting of voice within character seems to be the hallmark of the deeper meaning of heteroglossia. As so often in real life, the viewer's experience of these two characters shifts rapidly, sympathies vary, and we aren't always sure who is taking advantage of whom, or whether anybody is taking advantage of anybody else. Maybe Zenobia is right that buying this building will work out well for her. Maybe Goodnight is correct that she is making a terribly poor decision. Maybe both are right. Zenobia asks Goodnight, do you know anything about the distressed real estate market? To which he answers that he does not. And then she asks whether he owns 4 buildings in this same price range that are already turning a profit, to which the answer is no again. And the audience seems to have learned some new facts about Zenobia, as this aspect of her character has not yet been mentioned in the show. When he answers no again, she says, maybe you should take your Dungeons and Dragons breath to the car and let me do what I do. Suddenly, the scene cuts back to the police car where the man who had been arrested for trying to run off with the microwave is still sitting in the back seat. Hey, that's funny. I like her, he says. She got you on that one, Carl Winslow. Once again, even in this minor character, voice does not simply align with character, but instead one character inhabits multiple perspectives in quick succession. So here, this multiplication of voice and interest only intensifies as the plot proceeds. After purchasing the house, Zenobia enters only to find that one of the 2 apartments is already occupied by a woman who describes herself as the Dorothy Lorene Brown, the maverick of the Chicago Civil Rights Movement, who has already paid all her dues and therefore does not and will not pay rent. Along the way, Dorothy describes Zenobia as a gentrifier. Goodnight offers both benefits and drawbacks of gentrification. Dorothy attacks both of them for being cops. And a verbal exchange escalates between Dorothy and Zenobia that is insulting enough to echo the dozens. When we return to the plot, Zenobia begins in an ameliorative tone, calling Brown Ms. Dorothy and offering that she has explored Dorothy's history in Chicago civil rights and she should be treated with respect. Zenobia apologizes by saying, I know my life is better for your hard work. I'm sorry. This feels and seems heartfelt and genuine. There is a bit of a meeting of minds around the fact that people complain about both Dorothy's and Zenobia's attitudes, and Zenobia offers Dorothy a gift of a tin of popcorn, thus connecting to the A-plot. Quickly, the rapprochement turns sour, as it turns out that Zenobia has included an application for a Section 8 voucher at the bottom of the tin. Dorothy reacts badly, and Zenobia switches tones abruptly, saying that Dorothy, quote, could never be her favorite civil rights icon, because that is in fact Coretta Scott King, who is beloved. She is a queen. Dorothy responds, fuck Coretta Scott King. Now you may know her as King, but I know her as Retta. Always thought she was so funny, Dorothy says. Well, that bitch never made me laugh once. That's the part of the show, and you're just dizzy by it, right? I mean, I don't know that Coretta Scott King had any particular claim to being a comedian of some sort or anything, but they certainly make it seem like this is, this should be obvious. Zenobia responds by saying, "Say one more motherfucking thing about Coretta Scott King, I will bust in broad daylight, bitch. Bitch, I don't give a fuck." And she actually takes out her gun. The swapping and alternations of voice and interest in this scene are dizzying. Zenobia doesn't really seem to be threatening Dorothy with her gun, but the possibility of police violence still looms large. We don't know with any certainty whether Dorothy really is a civil rights icon or some kind of pretender or both. Her mockery of Coretta Scott King for aspiring to be funnier than she actually really was appears to be pure absurdity. Yet the stakes are too high to think of the scene as pure absurdism. But most importantly, I don't think any viewer can watch the scene and have a clear sense of who is right and who is wrong, who is doing a good thing and who a bad thing, and so on. Each character is doing some exploiting, and each character is also pursuing her genuine interest in less exploitative fashion. Each character represents a number of variations of the authentic Black voice of the South Side, and yet each voice is multiple and hard to pin down. My view is that this kind of heteroglossic presentation forces the viewer to think more carefully than she otherwise might about the various positions taken by all these characters and their actions, and to try harder than we otherwise might to sympathize with all of them. These impulses are only compounded in the plot's final scene when Zenobia tries to implement her next solution to the problem by leasing out the other apartment in the building. Her candidate tenants turn out to be a couple of white graduate students from a nearby university who arrive in full-throated support of civil rights and racial integration. Yet very quickly the scene unravels, principally due to the couple's dog, who runs out of the car in apparent friendliness toward Dorothy. Dorothy seems to be afraid of dogs, and as the couple tries to call the dog back, we learn the dog is named Blackie, a name, they assure us, that came with the dog when they rescued it. Both Goodnight and Zenobia immediately tell them that they need to change the dog's name, which the couple immediately acknowledges, but the scenario is already devolved. It is hard not to see this couple, despite themselves occupying a kind of multiple voicedness, as also representing a kind of critical monologism that the show is trying to undo. While the couple are presented as good-natured, their lack of common sense and detailed local knowledge dooms them to ridicule from all sides. The situation never resolves in this episode or in the series as a whole, but instead is left in suspension. All we know is that simple solutions to all the very real problems brought up in this situation fail, and that sympathy is required for everyone, even the white couple, despite their manifest failings. Further, I can't help but notice that this deep heteroglossia of voice, character, and interest occurs in plot, scenario, and a program that is by design high comedy, or low comedy, or it might be. Despite the occasional flashes of anger and even the possibility of violence, the program rejects melancholy out of hand, even suggesting, not least through Dorothy's mockery of Coretta Scott King, that an aptly turned sense of humor is absolutely vital to addressing many of our deepest problems, including the problems of the Southside community. I don't have much to offer in terms of speculation about why fictional representation might have turned toward heteroglossia at a moment when both critical discourse and social media discourse seem to be turning away from it. Or at best, I have a very pedestrian speculation, which is that the challenge of presenting and inhabiting the perspectives of various actual human beings, whether done through the novelist's imagination of character or the more complicated circulation of writer, producer, and actor in filmic and televisual representation, leads to more sympathy for and embrace of the complexities of human experience, even in the face of our most serious political and cultural problems. Obviously, such multifaceted representation can and does take place in tragic narratives, but it is also interesting to me how much recent heteroglossic narrative is fundamentally comic. It seems hard not to think that many creators are concerned about the underlying melancholia that worries Paul so much in Love's Shadow, and to ask how an emancipatory politics can proceed from a fundamentally nihilistic worldview. Thank you.
Few minutes. Question? No.
I'll start. So thank you. That was fun to hear. And so I guess I just had maybe two things. One is about social media, and it's just like maybe an addition to think about. I think it's not only social media, but also like niche markets. And thinking about the breakup of the network broadcasting into niche markets. Like, I think that there's something that's completely consistent with what you're talking about there as well. And then the other was a question about like reading, because you said in these classes you read fiction and you read the film, you said you read the text, so I take it to be the fiction and
Yeah.
film or the TV shows. And so I'm wondering where you see reading and what you're talking about. So I think what I heard you saying was mostly about sort of like writing theory, the writing of the novels, the scripts, the acting, right? So I'm just curious, like where would you place reading, like reading practices?
Yeah, that's very interesting, and I haven't really thought about it enough. But I mean, and my immediate response is probably not adequate. That I feel like some of the texts I'm criticizing without mentioning them, like demand that you understand in one way, right? And I feel like some of the stuff that I did mention, like invites the reader to engage, and is not certain how the reader will come, what they will take away from it, right? And that it invites a multiple response from readers, and that it's certainly in classes where we use this material, right? I can ask things. This is wrong, but I ask things like, what does this author think about race, right? And like, I don't have to like get into these like very, very pointed, very detailed questions. And an open question like that can produce all kinds of different responses from people, which I take to be readings, right? Their own readings of what this might mean.
I guess, can I put it in a different?
Yeah.
There's something about reading theory in your theory classes now that it's like perhaps I'm not just like right.
Please.
But perhaps there's a way that like students are not kind of not open to, but there's something going on with the reading of the theory. I don't even know how to diagnose it, but there's something going on with reading of theory that doesn't adhere in reading fiction and reading, media. So I guess.
No, I agree with that a lot. I think it seems to me that in reading, especially some of the theory I'm not mentioning, that there is a response like I'm supposed to find the right slogan and say it. And that's all I can do. That's my discussion for this item. Whereas fiction and film, like they don't feel like they have a particular right thing they have to utter. They can talk about all kinds of stuff. And I really feel for the students. I feel like they are inhibited in a lot of ways by some of the demands that I feel like social media puts on them. And sometimes they're even thinking, what if somebody films this class and puts it up on Twitter? And like, I don't want to say something that's going to get me in trouble. And then I noticed that, reading books like the books I mentioned, they say stuff which, my own social media man is like, well, if somebody filmed that and took out 4 words of what you just said and put it up on Twitter, you might get in trouble. It would be a misunderstanding. Said like there's some ability to relax.
I thought it was a really wonderful presentation. You took a risk, and I thought brought into play a whole set of very important. I have a couple of questions, and one is I wonder why, given your openness to multiple theoretical perspectives, you take Bakhtin's heteroglossia, and when say there are really conflicted series of negotiations going on, attention to way in which that particular moment discloses the theoretical, let's call it the bottom line, you're reading of Bakhtin. Given your pedagogy, wouldn't it be kind of wonderful to bring in the South Side episode to your theory class and use it, and to bring in not just say Bakhtin, but say Stuart Hall, in theorizing alternative ways to utilize already sedimented positions in order to generate a counter-agent. You could perhaps bring in Spivak and show how the show is deploying. That is, make it, well, why not have a hybrid between your fiction class and your theory class? That's one, but the other one has to do with melancholy and humor. Is it necessarily the case that someone who has a great sense of humor would be other than melancholic? Isn't ongoing melancholy the breeding ground for great humor? Because the melancholy is sustaining a kind of you make peace with loss when you can convert melancholy into laughter, which is puffing away and brings nothing and turning nothing into a pleasure rather than a burden. So it's just that I'm wondering whether you might want to theorize, in other words, your enjoyment, what clearly brings your mood up. You have and maybe I'm mishearing, but as I hear you maintaining your jovial, and which I love, attitude, whether that too is working through stuff that might not be jovial. So is it necessary to sustain a Manichean distinction between melancholy and laughter?
Yeah, those are great questions. I don't think I would. Maybe Paul wants to say something about melancholy. Since he is the person I'm thinking of most when doing that, I feel like the melancholia that worries me is the like obsessive. This is the only way. You're absolutely right that, I mean, when I think of mourning versus melancholia, which is itself a kind of making distinction, but that the working through, I invite and want, and like I don't want to get lost in the melancholia, and I don't even.
No, I applaud you. I hear exactly what you're saying. Was it friendly question?
Absolutely, and the other thing that you asked about, I do try to mix that stuff, and in fact, this is partly a trip through what I've been teaching this semester. I teach a little unit on heteroglossia. The students seem to like it, and I do try to talk about even something Carmen did her question yesterday. What is the difference between heteroglossia in a written work versus in embodied filmic or televisual work where you have actual people? I think that itself, and because Bakhtin really wasn't thinking so much about film and stuff when he wrote that. Absolutely, I like teaching that because the heteroglossia itself is not. It is not that kind of, unitary. It's a topic that people can talk about. I find that students actually tend to write papers about that because, Jonathan, Christian.
Two things on Don's point about humor and melancholy. There's a story whose status I have no idea of, but its key phrase is "I am revolved." Basically, a guy comes in at 6+ years, and the counselor says, "Oh, but you should go see Grimaldi."
Absolutely.
So, you didn't explain how you made your fiction TV show reading lists. You didn't say how you make your theory reading lists, and it sounds like somehow you were teaching a body of writing to which you feel some duty that you don't yourself admire or feel invincible.
Oh, no. In fact, the truth is, I do have a body of work that I like to teach, like Can the Subaltern Speak and Mama's Baby, Papa's Maybe, and some writing on heteroglossia that I love, and I'm so happy to teach. And what constrains me is I feel like I can't assign more recent stuff, and I have tried to put on more recent stuff, and I find that it tends to have this very deadening effect. And it pains me that I can't teach stuff that's 30 years old. I wish, I could. I wish.
In terms of the recent people that you can you just name?
No, I'm not going to. I think Paul glances at some of it in Love's Shadow. Yeah, I will say one thing using the same example Paul does, some of the recent work in Afro-pessimism, I find, even when I assign works in support and critical of it, and this is more in graduate classes, people are so constrained about talking about it. And even though I can raise these other issues with other work, and like, I think at least similar issues with their work, that the tone of it concerns me. It seems nihilistic. I've already said something now I'm dreading showing up on social media.
Thank you.